Good, live and ready to go. Okay. Hi, everybody. We're like 1 minute out. We're going to start shortly. I just want to give everybody a second to join us and trickle in. We got a couple of people. We don't officially start, well, right now, but we'll give everybody like 30 seconds to join us. In the meantime, if you want to drop in the chat what you do for work, I'm really interested to, we had a pretty diverse group of folks registered for this, and I would love to hear where you guys are, what you do, and yeah, how we can maybe use some of that information to tailor this conversation a little bit. So welcome, we're gonna get started really, really shortly. All right. Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to be talking today about how to create an impactful DE&I program. We want to make sure that the information that we are sharing today really benefits your employees, your human workforce, and your bottom line. As we were researching this topic, the idea of mingling profitability with the human experience seemed a little gross, but it's a story that needs to be told because the future of work very much depends on diversity, and we want to tell that story. So we're going to get started. We have a jam-packed agenda today. This is a topic that absolutely cannot be talked about in an hour. There's just absolutely no way. But we're going to try our best to at least tee up the conversation. And if you guys have follow-up questions, we're always here to answer them. But we're going to start with introductions. We have two unbelievable panelists with us today. We're going to talk about what the business case is for creating a DE&I strategy, and how leaders, especially white leaders, can champion this conversation with their organizations. How HR leaders or business leaders can create a policy or a work environment that benefits everybody. And understanding the global workforce in totality, and what American business leaders think of DE&I is not the same as is represented in the rest of the world. A little bit about us. I want to talk about Globality really quickly. We're obviously hosting this webinar, but you might be thinking, like, what does a language and culture company have any business talking about DE&I? And actually, I think a lot. We were founded by an immigrant. We are minority owned, and we really firmly believe that cultural understanding, and especially language, the words that we use to communicate with each other, is at the foundation of equity, right? And we're going to get to that point in a second, but we really firmly believe in putting people first. It's why we put humans to humans. We connect humans with other human beings to understand language and culture. We really firmly believe in the human connection, and fully understanding how people connecting with other people can make a positive impact on somebody's lives. Our mission is to empower professionals and their families to live, work, and communicate successfully anywhere in the world. That's the goal, right? Somebody, well, you know, a white girl in North America should have the same rights as literally anybody else in the world doing the same job. Like I said, we're minority owned, founded by an immigrant, and celebrating diversity really is at the heart of who we are. That's why we think we have every right in the world to talk about this. I want to introduce our phenomenal presenters today. I would like to introduce you to Aparna Ray. She's the founder of Moving Beyond. It's a startup that's building solutions to solve complex DE&I and people challenges using real-time employee voice and impact data, experiential e-learning, and innovative lab approach grounded in human-centered design. Sam is going to be joining her. Sam is a SHRM certified professional, and he has an extensive background in functional components of HR with competencies in DE&I, compensation and benefits, talent acquisition, employee relations, and employee communications. He has an MBA from the University of Chicago and is a really active member of the SHRM community. So we brought these two folks together because literally nobody's better equipped to talk about DE&I than these two. They live and breathe it. They have made it a living out of talking about it and sharing their expertise with others. And we really, would like to share that with all of you. I'm going to introduce myself really quickly. My name is Patricia Diaz. I have been in marketing for a very long time. I've spent the last 6 years really focused on education, marketing, and proving that skills are what should get people jobs and promoted, and not their gender or their race or their educational background. If I really firmly believe that if somebody has the skills to do a job, they have every right to be successful. We're going to try a little exercise. I would love everybody to put into the Q&A. The chat is disabled for now, only because it's kind of a loaded topic, and I want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable sharing their expertise. So there's a Q&A section here. I want you to all close your eyes for a second, take 10 seconds, and think about, what does an immigrant look like to you? What do they look like? What do they do for work? What do they do for fun? What does their family look like? What does their educational background look like? Just take a second to think about, in your own experience, what an immigrant looks like in your world. And if you're comfortable sharing that, drop that into the chat. But if not, keep it in your head and marinate on that for a second. So while you guys are mulling that over, I want to talk a little bit about what diversity looks like in the future of work. And I'm teeing this up because the future of work really belongs to a new generation. Data suggests that over 75 million boomers are set to retire in the next 6 years. So by 2030, 75 million people are exiting the workforce, while they're being replaced by a younger generation who very much values and insists on working for a diverse company. So Gen Z is actually the most racially diverse US generation. Approximately 48% of Gen Z identify as non-white, which is a major shift from the last 50 years of commerce in the United States. 1 in 3 Americans is projected to belong to a race other than white by 2060, with the fastest growing US racial or ethnic group being with those who are 2 or more races. So the way that we look at work, the way that we bring our full selves to work, is going to change very dramatically, especially in the next decade, as older, predominantly white employees exit the workforce and are replaced by people who don't look like them. According to the Center for Immigration Studies, there has been a decades-long decline in the labor force participation rate in the US born of working age, 16 to 64, from 77.3% in 2000 to 73.5% in the fourth quarter of 2022. So what does that mean? People are looking for jobs, again, that reflect their personal values. And despite what headlines say about inflation and the economy, especially in the United States, unemployment is actually at the lowest rate it's been since it's been recorded since 1969. There are 2 open roles for every 1 job seeker, which means that people still have their pick of the litter. And the data is really clear. The future of work belongs to immigrants and Generation Z, and they are very intentional about where they go to work. Who is putting their money where their mouth is? Who is putting training dollars behind being equitable and fair? Who is not waging a war against woke or whatever, and making sure that, like, equity is not a buzzword, but an actual philosophy that they stand by and live on every single day. And the companies that fail to realize that, I really firmly believe, will die. They will go the way of Blockbuster and Kodak, because there will be nobody to do that work when it's time to replace an older workforce. In the United States right now, 25% of STEM workers, 25% are immigrants. So we're not just talking about manufacturing and retail and automotive. We're not talking about agriculture. We are actually, these are highly intelligent, capable, high earning individuals that are part of the US workforce that can't be discounted. They can't be discounted anymore. This is not, like I said before, this is not a war on woke. This is very much just a conversation about inclusivity and how everybody at work can thrive in the best way possible. And that includes retaining and engaging them, right? Like as Gen Z enters the workforce, a lot of data really strongly suggests that they care about upskilling opportunities. They want to know that their employer is invested in their personal growth as much as their professional growth. And that very much comes with being equitable and entering a diverse workforce. I'm going to hand this over. Actually, before we get to this, I would love to have Aparna give us a couple of minutes telling her story, because I think it's unbelievable. And it will really tee up the idea of what a global workforce looks like.
Hi, everybody. It's really nice to meet you, even though we can't see you. Welcome to this conversation. My name is Aparna Ray, and I'm the founder of Moving Beyond. We are a management consulting firm of sorts based in Seattle, Washington. So it's still pretty early in the day for me today, and I'm excited to be here with you. When I met Sam and Patricia, I think the very first conversation we had was, like, what has the journey been? What's the last 20 years of my life been as an immigrant who moved here in the middle of 10th grade, which, let me just say, is a super awkward time to move to a new country, even when you speak the language. And so I moved to a small town in rural America when I was 15 years old, and lived through the impacts of 9/11. And that was one of probably the biggest, most catalyzing moment in my journey of living and working in the United States, and really experiencing firsthand the xenophobia and I experienced kind of two things, like when I told people that I grew up in India and the Middle East, I would get asked some really obnoxious questions about whether I knew any terrorists, as if they're just kind of out in the wild introducing themselves to teenagers. And the second experience that I often had was when somebody would hear me speaking in another language. I would have, women walk up to me and ask me if I was a nanny or if I cleaned homes, right? They were looking for a helper and they would approach me. And that that's shaped how I've experienced this country, but it's also really motivated me to lean into entrepreneurship. Moving Beyond is my fourth company, and the first couple, they've all really been focused on learning and development and workforce related sort of career mobility startups. My very first one was focused on helping immigrant and refugee women build really successful food businesses and walk them through everything from getting their licenses and permitting and building out a pipeline of really delicious food. Our first couple of years, we worked heavily with people from Somalia, Cambodia, from Iran, and lots of other places. And since then, I've gone on to start a couple of other companies, but my focus now really is on helping organizations and leaders who, in my line of work, tend to be predominantly white, really think about how to build substantive and sustainable equity and inclusion programs for their organizations, grounded in data, grounded in the needs and experiences of their workforce, and built in ways that are going to last. So that's what I do now. And yeah.
If you're comfortable sharing, you told Sam and I a really interesting story about your dad's journey when you guys moved to the United States. And if you're comfortable sharing that, I think it's an interesting tidbit to remember, because even though 9/11 was 22 years ago, I feel like that situation was not unique. It was not left in the past. I think that happens pretty frequently today, if you don't mind. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
I mean, that situation is not unique, and I think that there are such deep assumptions and biases and stereotypes about where people come from, and people around the world have them. This is not unique to the American experience, but I think that there is a kind of really intense violence that people of color and immigrants experience in the United States. And so, I mean, we had been living in the Middle East when our turn came up to immigrate to the United States, right? And I'm in the 10th grade. And so we moved to Illinois, and right after 9/11, I'm called in to my barista job, right? Like we're talking like super teenager makes $6 an hour making coffee at the mall job. And I remember the owner just kind of point blank saying, you know, that she was worried about the impact of having a worker that may have like ties to terrorists. And I was really surprised. You know, I was like, well, you know, I moved from Qatar, and like, like, it's not like everybody who lives in the Middle East is a terrorist. Like, what a wild thing to say. But like, I'm all of like 15 or 16 years old and definitely don't have like the social and cultural skills to navigate this moment. And it was many, many months later that I found out that my dad, who was the head chef in a 5-star hotel on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, was demoted to a sous chef following 9/11. And, you know, I think every time I tell that story, the reactions range from, oh my God, I'm so sorry, to, you know, why didn't you get a lawyer? And I think that like this is the part of the American experience where, I mean, how would you even know? How would you
Yeah.
even know that what happened to you was not illegal, that was like so incredibly discriminatory? And you know, like what are the impacts when something like that happens? Is like it literally plunged our family into poverty. So it's, you know, like I think, and we make little decisions like this all the time, like in my work with leaders, especially folks in HR. I've noticed this kind of like pushing off, you know, where they'll say, well, we're not, you know, we're not going to promote this person because they're not old enough, or they're not experienced enough, or they're not polished enough, or nobody understands their accent, or any number of things that are, I'll say like on the, like they're not valid, they're not really great reasons. And when they're doing that, and I think now in my late 30s, I have influence, and you know, I have like relationships of trust with senior leaders where I can actually say to them, you know, when you're making that decision, I really want you to think about what the impact is going to be, not only for that person, their career, their, you know, like career trajectory, mobility, but also what's the impact of their families.
Yeah.
Um,
I heard a really interesting tidbit actually. A colleague was sharing a story with me when I told her we were doing this webinar, and I'm first generation American. I'm the first, you know, my siblings and I were the first to go to college, and she shared a similar story. Her parents were immigrants. She was the first in her generation to go to college, and she made a point about not getting a promotion based on what she was convinced was, you know, her background, her cultural background. And she made a point of saying like she didn't have anybody to bounce. It's not like she could go to her parents and say, is this what you experienced? Or what was your experience in the workforce? Because she couldn't talk about it. She had nobody to talk about it with. And I think that's like, especially in our age group, as we are, you know, entering the workforce and climbing the corporate ladder, it's hard to have these conversations openly and honestly when we don't have, you know, the family crutch to lean back on. I can't go to my parents and ask, what was your experience in the workforce? They didn't even live here at the time. Same with your parents, Aparna. Like it's really nuanced and weird for immigrant kids to accept, you know, immigrants come to this country and they're told you have to work really hard, you have to earn everything you get, just shut up and put your head down and work as hard as you can. And then when we get into the workforce, we kind of think to do the same, right? Like if somebody is discriminatory or, you know, cutting us off at the knees, like we don't question it because we're just happy to have a job and we're, you know, happy to have a seat at the table sometimes. So I think that like people's unconscious contribution to that conversation has everything to do with their background and their family dynamic and their education and where they came from and their cultural upbringing. Which leads us really perfectly into the slide, actually, like how Americans think about DE&I is not the same as the rest of the world, right? Like this is not a statement of wokeness, but the last 100 years, 150 years, 200 years in the United States has been rife with racial discrimination and disparity. There's just no question about it. We can't have this conversation without looking behind us and understanding where we're coming from. But most of you work for global organizations, right? Like while you may work in the United States or have colleagues in the United States, especially given what COVID did for global connectivity. We can't ignore the rest of the world. We can talk about this in the United States, but chances are you're going to encounter a customer or a prospect or a colleague who lives on the opposite side of the world and has a totally different, unique perspective to the way that they handle life than you do. Sam, if you don't mind walking us through this slide a little bit, I would love to shed some light on it.
Sure. So Sam Sanders, head of HR for Global OT. I am just excited to be having this discussion with Aparna and Patricia as well. Aparna, your story, when Patricia and I first heard it, really for me highlighted some of the issues that exist that exist globally. I like that you pointed out that while your the things that happen to you, it's not specific to America. It's not specific to the U.S. And so one, I think context is important. So when we look at the global context, we know that 17.4% of the U.S. workforce as of 2021, it's foreign. And so when we think about like the impact of language in that context, should English be the default? And from our perspective, when we look at the bottom line, the impact that it has to morale in the workforce, no, it absolutely shouldn't. And so these are things that I think are important when we come to the table to have discussions. One, acknowledging and recognizing that the what that experience or DEI focus is in the United States may be different if you have employees in Asia. And so just to sort of point out sort of those, in the US, our focus around DE&I issues, part of it has to do with what is regulated, so what laws or parameters are set. And that often will signify a focus, a corporate focus. In other areas, those priorities or value may be different. And so if we think about Asia, there might be a ethnicity versus race. There might be a higher priority around nationality or gender equality when we talk about pay equity or having opportunities within the organization. The other piece I think is important to know that when we think about celebrations, and I think that this happens subconsciously in an effort to sort of have a blanket response to a DE&I strategy or answer is, incorporating sort of nonsensical or it's even, we were discussing before this webinar, this non-traditional approach to holidays or anniversaries, and Cinco de Mayo came up, right? And we know that that's typically associated with a particular culture. And the truth of the matter is it's not an accurate depiction of history, or there's very little correlation there. And so being sensitive to the area and demographics that you're in. And a part of that, I think, is, again, connecting with, understanding your demographics of your workforce. And then the also is knowing what laws or regulations are in place that would sort of help sort of set that priority as well. But there are different focuses, I think, depending on where in the role you are. And being sensitive to those areas is I think, high.
Oh, no. I want to talk about this point really quickly. He made a point about compliance, like the laws in the U.S. As regards to DE&I and equality are pretty fluid, to put it gently. I think that the decision the Supreme Court put out a couple months ago about affirmative action should make that point loud and clear. But as far as regulation and compliance issues go, I think a lot of people think or don't think about the implications of a non-English speaking worker being safe and understanding the totality of their role at work, and how that literally translates into having signage that's translated multilingually, having interpreters that are available. Sam's point about Cinco de Mayo, you know, culture is not a costume. We wrote a blog about this a couple of weeks ago. You know, showing up to a Cinco de Mayo party in a sombrero and a fake mustache isn't funny. Like, that's not celebrating anybody's culture. That's like just the laziest, sloppiest form of cultural celebrations. And really like understanding what motivates people, what gets them, what will allow them to bring their full selves to work. Do they feel comfortable speaking up in meetings, even though they have an accent? Do they feel comfortable sharing their lunch, you know, with their colleagues, even though it, you know, it's not a white bread sandwich or whatever? You know, like how people show up in as themselves holistically at work has an impact on every other part of the organization, from productivity to retention and engagement and turnover. So cultural choices very much matter, whether they're regulated or mandated or not.
Great.
Let's address the elephant in the room, shall we? Let's just deal with this head on. I told folks that I was moderating this webinar, and I got asked a lot. I thought you were white. Like, people ask me that like it's nothing. Yes, my last name is Diaz. That is my married name. I am fully a white girl. I get a lot of pushback about why I should even be involved in this conversation, and I don't want to be the one to lead this part of it. I'm gonna let the actual DE&I experts handle this, but let's talk about the reality of it. Not all at once.
I'll let you take that first step.
Me, I'm going to take the first step.
Yeah.
Yeah, like what business do white folks have? I mean, all of it. You know, I don't think of DEI as something separate from how we live and work. I mean, it's not a new thing, right? And so the way that I think about DE&I is the extent to which our organizations are fair and consistent for all employees in ways that are gonna ensure that we're hiring and retaining and promoting people equitably. And so for me, you know, I went to graduate school to study decolonizing pedagogy 15 years ago, and come from having a really strong theoretical base in a lot of this work. At the end of the day, what it boils down to is, are you making sure that you have the right policies and practices? Are you making sure that you are fair to people and you are being consistent? And, you know, one of the things that I think about a lot is, and I shared this with both of you, Sam and Patricia, is I look at, for instance, bereavement policies and the implementation of bereavement policies inside of organizations. Now, the US, of course, lags in, you know, just sufficient time off to deal with life. It lags way behind just about every other country in the world. And so there aren't, you know, I mean, most companies come up with their own bereavement policies. Like, how much time am I going to give somebody off that's paid time when they're experiencing deep loss, or deep for them, right? Which could mean an immediate family member. I think sometimes it also means pets. It could mean a close friend. A lot of times, you know, when someone passes that's close to you, it's not just simply about showing up to their funeral. It's also about cleaning up their house, like, you know, making 10 runs to the Goodwill. There's so much that happens when someone passes, and most organizations will give folks a day off, right? I think the most generous policies I've seen are 3 days. And when we start talking about and understanding how policies are implemented, we start to see that when a manager has affinity with their employees, they'll give folks a week off. They'll give folks a week of paid time off at their discretion. But when they don't have affinity, with that employee when that employee is immigrant, non-native English speaker, they might be a person of color, they might be queer. There's a range of identities and factors. They might be rule sticklers to the bereavement policy, right? They might say, well, Sam, like our policy is 3 days. And so really all I can do is give you 3 days off. And then I expect you to be at work. And I've heard, over my career, just so many people who have been put on PIPs and other kinds of like performance improvement plans when there's been a big loss in their life. And over the past 3 years, I just can't help but notice the ways in which it's disproportionately impacted people that are people of color, people that are immigrants, people that have disabilities, people that are queer. I mean, these are the folks that have died from COVID or sustained like really like debilitating chronic illness as a result of COVID. Also like we're still in the pandemic. And yeah, I see the impact that it's had on their careers. And so when I think about DEI and my invitation for people that are white, that'll say, well, I don't want to touch this topic because it's not really about me. Actually, it's literally about you. You're the ones that are making the rules. You're the ones that are enforcing the rules. You're the ones that are showing up with like such incredible biases. There's no, like, it literally is your work to address, to build policies, to shape organizational cultures, and quite frankly, sometimes to know when to give up your seat and bring somebody in who has both, I would say, the hard skills, but that also has the lived experiences that are going to be able to shape those policies, practices, cultures.
How do you prevent the white savior conversation? How can a white person, maybe we could say this for the Q&A, you make the point that 63% of diversity and inclusion leadership roles are occupied by white women. How can we, speaking as a white woman, like how can we give up our seat without making it seem like we're just trying to be the hero? How can we give voices without trying to, be the savior or, pull somebody up behind us? Like, I would love an honest conversation about that.
Yeah, and Patricia, I think that is exactly the nexus of the conversation. So candidly, our discussion yesterday, right? We approached this and I'll tell the audience, brace yourself, right? So if the beauty of having a white person lead the discussion or be part of that discussion is exactly what this statistic is saying, right? I'll share an anecdote. Was a part of a leadership group, and the thing that put us together is that we were making decisions for the organization. The thing that made us different from the rest of the organization is that as we're talking about in-person meetings and planning activities for the rest of the organization that requires participation from the entire organization, parents, the voice of a parent was not included. And so as a repercussion of not including the voice of a person with school-age children in that room, we didn't take into consideration when schools would go back, when parents would have to make, considerations for childcare. Why am I sharing that? Why is that important? The same sort of decisions, the same sort of conversations happen around policy, around programs, around promotions, around opportunities within organizations. And if that is not an area of concern, if that's not something that you yourself, a person of privilege, has to deal with, you don't necessarily have, you don't know to share that experience. And so,
yeah.
So what we talked about is it's important beyond the corporate space to what does your friend group look like?
Mm-hmm.
what is your circle of the people that you trust the most? What are those people comprised of, right? And so I think a part of the discussion starts there, but the white person's seat at the table is that of an ally, and I think sometimes it's even you have the open door by way of privilege, and so lending the voice typically to someone we feel comfortable lending our seat at the table to someone we're comfortable with. Mm-hmm. And so stretching out, having those more diverse relationships, I think is the first step, but also not being afraid to stand up for someone that you feel is not getting opportunities or asking questions. So there's a huge bit there for my perspective.
I mean, you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah.
Like I will never have the breadth of experience that you have, Sam, or Aparna has, or anybody. You don't know what you don't know. Right. And I think as white folks, having some level of vulnerability, which is weird for white people, especially in corporate America, we're not used to that stance, but admitting that we don't have all of the answers and we don't have the breadth of experience that somebody else might have, I think is the first step to actually implementing meaningful change. Great. I'm not the right person to talk about this or influence a policy or whatever, but I can talk about what I'm making. I can talk about the benefits I'm getting. I can talk about the promotions I've gotten. I can talk about the cultural training. There are some ways that white folks can show up in a better, more intentional, thoughtful way, in a way that doesn't make them seem like, God, thank God they were the ones who said something. You know what I mean? That absolutely does more harm than good. But we make a point here about tangible changes that white leaders can make, and leveraging your privilege is not a bad thing. You can't deny the fact that white people get paid more for the same work that brown people do, that our mentorship opportunities are more abundant. I think, we make points here about advocating for structural changes, being loudmouths when it's appropriate, and being consistent. This is not the kind of thing where we can speak up in one meeting and think we change the world. It takes a daily, intentional, thoughtful, consistent argument or change or conversation.
Yeah.
Sam, you want to take this slide? We have a little bit of a stat to share.
Yeah, so the bottom line, and this is, when we talk about representation, it's acknowledging that, compared to individual decision makers, diverse teams make better decisions 66% of the time, right? So if we're talking about looking at the first stat that we saw, that more than 20% of the global workforce, it's foreign. If we recognize that more than 60% of decisions are made when there is a diverse team, and so it absolutely impacts the bottom line. But the other piece to this that I think it's important to hone in on is when you have folks that are engaged, when you have people that show up and feel like they belong, when there is buy-in, or there is a consideration for an idea or thought, or a group, those people, engaged people typically are more productive, and they want to build and help the organization reach its milestone and goals. And so it absolutely impacts the bottom line, but also we're talking about morale and engagement, which every organization, as we're talking about a competitive workforce, just as employers have global opportunities, and so as employees. And so, as the workforce is aging, it's important that we're thinking about what does the global folks that make up the workforce, what do they want? They want to work for diverse organizations that have diverse priorities. So.
And diverse teams, talking about the bottom line, it's not all about money, right? But we live in a capitalistic society. There's no denying it. Diverse teams are 20% more profitable. They bring in more revenue than companies who have a workforce that looks exactly like each other. So the bottom line is very much impacted by cultural diversity and acceptance and inclusivity. All right. experts, Aparna, Sam, let's talk about somebody who's starting from scratch. They know they need something. They need to address this problem head on. They do not know where to begin. How would you recommend that they start?
Sure. So a part of it, I think, is understanding, having a clear vision about how does this organization want to show up, right? You know, and again, if we're talking about a global workforce, depending on where you are, that strategy or that focus will look different. So I think it's first acknowledging, you know, how does that organization want to show up for its people? You know, what legacy does it want to have? You know, does it want to have an organization that you know, is a centered DE&I focus, that this equal representation, or does it want to be all about profit? So I think a part of that is starting with your employees, getting a sense of again, tying this together when we talk about having allies, you know, folks that hear opportunities or decisions, you know, is there open lines of communication, being a part of, you know, employee resource group. You can get a sense of what your employees or your workforce needs. And then inviting, you know, those diverse groups to the table to be able to make critical decisions that impact them. That's ultimately going to get you buy-in. Aparna, I want you to have an opportunity to jump in there as well.
Yeah, I think, you know, for me, when I think about where I've seen organizations be successful, there are a couple of things I think that need to happen, and they need to happen side by side. People really need to spend time on their own learning, their own growth, and I think their own healing. And in my opinion, you know, if you're a white leader, this is not work that is, you know, on company time. Like, this is work that you need to be doing on your own with other white folks, and side by side, right? Like, in parallel, you can actually, you can actually just start with implementing and socializing and enforcing your actual policies. One of the things that I've been looking at is paid family and medical leave for women of color in tech. And there's a report that's going to come out next week from Reboot Representation that works on increasing the numbers of Black, Latina, and Native women specifically in tech. And what they've found is that these groups are the least likely to take paid leave inside of their companies because they are under so much pressure to work 17 times as hard as their white and Asian colleagues, you know? And so you don't have to go out and do anything new, and you don't have to go out and spend a ton of money on any consultant. You can start enforcing paid family and medical leave. And by the way, like, you also need to get men to take it, because that ultimately is what's going to level the playing field for women and for people of color. I think the same with, you know, policies around hair and makeup. I mean, we live in a country where employers can legally discriminate on the basis of hair. Employers can legally discriminate. People like Sam and I can actually lose our jobs for having the hair that we have. And so you can enforce policies around that. You can start to get better at making sense of the data that already exists in your applicant tracking systems, your HRIS, your learning management systems, you know. I mean, it's really easy to actually do the analysis on who are the hiring managers that are, you know, hiring and promoting a diverse slate, and who are the folks that are promoting kind of dominant culture groups, right? That are creating homogeneity. And then I think the other thing is building the skills and the confidence to have the really hard conversations with other executives around around setting targets, you know, like when we look at entry-level jobs in the workforce, not only are they representative in the United States of who makes up the country, in fact, Black women are overrepresented in the entry-level pool. They, with like 4 women, they are way more Black women are in our workforce than white women, for instance, right? But then when we start to look up at who are the directors and the VPs and in the C-suite and the boards of directors, that looks predominantly white, and that skews heavily male. And so there's lots of fear around setting quotas, but I think most organizations can actually set targets where they can say, hey, like we're going to promote proportionate to who are in our entry-level roles, right? We're going to commit to our entry-level roles being more diverse if they already aren't, and then we're going to promote representatively. So we're not firing every white director in our organization, but we're creating a pathway so that 5, 10, 15 years down the road, we've balanced the scales. And it takes time and it takes patience, and it's ultimately doable. I think the last thing that I'll say is listen to what people need. I see every single day leaders make accommodations for people that they have an affinity for, all of the time. If you went to, you know, like if we share an alma mater, right? Like if our families golf together or vacation together or what have you, right? You're making accommodations. There are people who get to experience flexibility, and there are people who are subjected to rules. And so ask yourself, like, what are the accommodations that, for instance, you need for non-native English speakers? We know that non-native English speakers in English dominant environments need a little bit more time to process information. They need more quiet time. And so it can often be as simple as making sure that meetings are kind of lumped together so that there is big chunks of open working time, or making sure that they get a good pair of noise canceling headphones if you have kind of an open office layout, so that they can actually think and like process information well, or you have quiet rooms that people can sneak into to do a little bit of focus work. So yeah, so my recommendation often, even though, you know, I am a consultant, is you don't actually need to spend a lot of time and money looking externally. There are so many things you can do here and now, and start there.
Do you think that somebody, especially at organizations that don't have a DE&I more, employees, like somebody who's specifically dedicated to, furthering this at their jobs, who's responsible for this? Does somebody need to own it? Is the default HR? Does a CEO need to step up and say, we need somebody to review our policies? Like, how would somebody who doesn't have an HR department to lean, or a DE&I department to lean on, how would they go about this? And how do they get buy-in from white male CEOs specifically? Like, how can somebody tee up that conversation to say, we don't have anything that even addresses equity in the workforce. I need you as a white male CEO to get on board with this. Like, how would they do that?
I would say, Aparna, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I mean, there's so many points that Aparna made that I think sort of dovetails into this. And yeah, I would agree that someone should own this process. And does it have to be the HR leader? Not necessarily. I think, what is going to be a telltale sign of the success is how representation shows up in those discussions, and then what do we do with the information? I think it's important. And I'll be the first to say, I love that. I love, doing surveys, but if we're not making the survey data actionable, right? Once we get a hold of it, right, then it's a null point. I also want to share. I also think it's critical that there are times, as Aparna mentioned, that we have a focus around entry-level roles, maybe in a tech company, and that happens where there'll be an extreme focus to go after a particular demographic. Well, 6 months, a year, 2 years has passed, and that has been accomplished. What typically happens is there's not a pivot in strategy. There's not a change in focus, because that original goal that we were looking for, a different set of demographic in that entry-level role, we're now accomplished that. Again, with the statistic that Aparna shared, if there is an overrepresentation of Black women in a particular industry or entry-level role, then it sounds like we've handled that, and it may be time to pivot. But yes, I think one person should own it, and that one person does not necessarily have to be the head of HR.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the conversation of like who owns it and how do you get buy-in? Everybody should own it. Everybody should own it. It's not just about, hiring, recruiting, promoting, advancement, right? Like it's also about supplier diversity. It's also about product development. It also is about community engagement. And so I've worked with probably, 50 companies in the last 3.5 years. Some of my most successful clients don't have anybody with this title at all. It's owned by everyone collectively, and they are making really incredible progress. I also have clients that have 12 people with this in their title, and they've made no progress, so it's not about the title, it's about, the mindsets. And I definitely want to dispel the myths around like white men. In my experience, and I'm not the only woman of color who's going to say this, white men are actually relatively easy to work with. It's actually the white women that are the hardest, most impossible people to move from their positions. With white men, my experience is that either like they're going to get on board relatively quickly, or they're going to tell you that they don't give a shit, and it's really clear cut. It's really, you're not out there guessing about like, hey, what's your position, Bob? Bob's going to tell you, right? He's either in or he's out, and there rarely is a middle ground. I think what I've seen white women do is a lot of gatekeeping, a lot of like sort of piecemeal efforts, and they stay with this narrative that they are an oppressed minority, having similar experiences to people of color, when in fact that's not true. And now we have, half a decade of data from McKinsey's Lean In study that happens every single year that shows us, right, like they've quantified some of these behaviors, and in every year, in every report, there's always a section that say that white women are the least supportive of any other group's mobility and interests. And to me, that's absolutely wild, right? Like to me, it's absolutely wild that you've climbed up the ladder and then you've pushed the ladder off so nobody else can climb up behind you.
Because the thought process is, I had to work so hard for it. You have to work so hard for it. It's not like I had to work so hard for it and let me help somebody else have a slightly less hard struggle. It's very much like you got to do what you have to suffer the same way that I have to suffer. And that is insane to me as well. As a white woman, I think it's insane. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is why I say, ultimately, people have to do their own work. People literally have to sit with and reflect on like what is their responsibility for culture change. They have to sit in and reflect on and heal from their trauma, this narrative that I've been oppressed, or I hear this a lot from HR leaders who are white women of a certain age, and they came into the workforce at a time when there was no paid family and medical leave, and FMLA was, not honored and enforced, and they had to come back to work like 2 or 3 or 4 weeks after they had their kids, and they had to really slog it out. And I'm just like, but why do you want that for anybody else?
No,
Why would
okay.
you want that?
I have a 5-year-old and I went back to work. I had a male boss and a male CEO. I went back to work 2 weeks after I had my kid, and nobody thought that that was weird. And then they changed the policy after I had a kid, and it was 2 weeks. That's not enough time for anybody to heal from childbirth. It was wild. But then they realized, like, these two white guys, that was kind of insane. We really shouldn't have made her do that. And they changed the policy to 4 months, totally paid. I didn't go back and say, like, that's unfair. I want my 4 months of pay. Thank God they implemented a policy. Like, thank God, the people behind me, like, had the actual time that they needed to heal and bond with their children. You know what I mean? Like, it's insane. Yeah. Like, why perpetuate the disparity and the pain that it causes? Like, it's so unnecessary. But I think, like, in this situation, when people know better, hopefully they do better. My white male boss who had no kids could not ever comprehend what I was going through. Never in a million years. And I'm glad that, like, at some point they came to their senses. But you're absolutely right. Like, and especially women of color, like, and immigrants, and people who don't know better, just think, like, I'll take whatever I can get. I just don't want to lose my job. Like, and I think that is up to everybody to change that conversation. 100%.
There's a question in the chat where someone said, how do we get white men to participate in DEI efforts without making them feel accused or threatened or like they're a target? And I mean, look, our world is boiling. Like literally, literally, our world is boiling. Like, climate change is like wiping out communities. It threatens our existence. Are we really going to be spending time managing the feelings of white men and white people in general? Like, I mean, we're 3 years out from the murder of George Floyd. More people of color are not in positions of leadership. Like, we are at peak wage inequity. The federal minimum wage is like $7.50, which doesn't even buy a sandwich at Subway. So, and every time I'm on a panel, I'll get questions around, well, how do we get people to, like, participate in this without making them feel bad? You should feel bad. You should literally feel bad. And you should be having these conversations, like, in your groups of white folk. I mean, this literally is white on white work. This is not the work of a Sam or an Aparna to come in and facilitate. Like, there's no business case that is ever going to be sticky and move people. People move people. Business cases don't move people. And I come back to something that was said to me by a client and a colleague and now friend many years ago. And she said, no company is going to lose betting on white supremacy.
That sucks.
No company in America is going to lose betting on white supremacy. And so, yeah, the work of standing out is totally hard work. And the reward is we get to live in a society where we don't have mass poverty. I mean, 50% of Americans live in poverty. 50% of Americans live in poverty. 50% of Americans cannot come with $500 in cash when they experience an emergency.
I love the, that you're highlighting the cost benefit, right? Like, what we could potentially, by hurting someone's feelings, what benefit do we end up with? Like, if the cost of me hurting white Americans' feelings means that we significantly reduce poverty, or that means people have different access to education, right? Like, I think that to me is a very valid point, and I would have to agree that it's our, and collectively, right, a time for us to there be a focus on what is the impact for the greater good?
We're literally at the top of the hour. I feel like I said at the beginning of this, we could talk about this for days, but I want to address a question really quickly because somebody made a comment about diversity in the name is polarizing, especially as diversity in DE&I has turned into a political issue, and being woke is a bad thing. The question is, what advice can you give to leaders who are considering the pushback on DE&I goals in the United States, especially as it has become politicized?
I'll try to give a 30-second answer. Like, I think the beauty or the benefit of having the reason why it's a priority is that the success of your organization is depending on it, and I think that's probably for me the most compelling story. The success of your people, when we think about our economy, the folks that make up that world, their ability to show up and feel considered or valued, or that their difference is important. Those things, and I think addressing that holistically is the benefit or beauty of having a diversity, equity, inclusion strategy.
Yeah, I would say you don't have to announce the revolution. You can do DEI work. I mean, we've been talking about it, right? Like, you can just enforce the things that already exist today. Right? You can propose changes to policies and practices. You don't have to go off. And in fact, I don't actually ever recommend anybody doing unconscious bias trainings or other like single topic trainings, period. So yeah, I mean, is a leader going to say, no, you don't have my buy-in on, pay equity or implementing paid family and medical leave? No, that's literally the law, right? Just like actually just go implement the law. And implement the policies and practices that you already have on the book. And that might be a really good place to start. And ultimately, like, build your capacity to have some of these hard conversations with your peers.
Yeah. And diversity is not a 4-letter word. Let's just like set that as the baseline. Like, having somebody who doesn't look like you or sound like you is not a bad thing in any circumstance.
Yeah.
We are a little bit over. Thank you both. Thank you, Aparna and Sam. Thank you, everybody, for your thoughtful questions and your contribution to this conversation. I hope that this is not the last time we talk about this. I hope that we can continue this conversation at scale, because it's a conversation that needs to be had over and over and over again until we get it right. And unfortunately, I think that's going to be a work in progress. Stay tuned. If you want to follow Global LT on LinkedIn, you can find us at global-LT. We share a ton of content about this topic and what diversity and equity and inclusion means, especially for non-white English-speaking people. So if you need additional resources, please come and find us. Aparna's on LinkedIn as well. Sam is on LinkedIn too. So if you'd like to connect with them and follow along with their journeys, we encourage you to do that. But thank you both. I love this conversation. And we'll see everybody soon.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks all.